Morning, everyone. Thank you to the Region of Peel and all the event partners and sponsors for inviting me to speak. While I was quite happy to get the invitation to come and give this presentation, I'm really most excited to listen at this conference. Yesterday, we listened as Christine Irvin cited for us the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook for 2012, which noted that 2/3 of all energy efficiency potential would remain untapped even if all current national and city policies were fully implemented. For me, that was an eye-opener, not a stat that I had seen before, but just a real eye-opener. I am a native Torontonian, but have spent the past 2 years living abroad in London, working with cities on climate change. Based on what I learned yesterday, there is a ton that cities and regions around the world can learn from us here in the GTHA, but there is also still a lot for us to learn, and that is what I hope to share with you this morning. So first, our agenda. In the time that I have, I'll tell you a bit about the organization that I work for, the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. Next, I'll share how leading cities around the world are working specifically on building energy efficiency. I hope to do justice to the work taking place in these cities by summarizing some of the best practices. And finally, I'll give you my take on emerging trends and lessons learned. The world's megacities are at the front lines in the battle against climate change. Whether it's urban traffic, energy consumption, solid waste issues, or the challenge of rising water levels, both the causes and effects of climate change focus on the world's largest cities. The C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group is a global network of the world's megacities and their mayors working to reduce carbon emissions and climate risks. It was founded by Ken Livingstone, then the mayor of London, and former US President Bill Clinton, as you heard. The immediate past chair of the organization is Toronto's own former mayor, David Miller, and the current chair is Michael Bloomberg of New York. Now, despite its name, and I'm sure this would come up, the C40 actually consists of 63 cities now, and that is made up of 42 megacities. Those are cities with over 3 million in population, and 21 smaller innovator cities. Those are cities below that 3 million threshold, but that are doing something really innovative across one of our 7 initiatives. All told, roughly 40 of the world's 50 largest metro regions are part of the C40. Now, 63 cities may not sound like enough to tackle the global challenge of climate change, but consider this. Taken together, the C40 cities and their metro areas contain or are responsible for roughly 8% of the world's population, total of 500 million people, roughly 5% of global annual carbon emissions, or 1.7 billion tons annually, and 21% of the entire global economy. That was valued at $13 trillion US last year. Taken together then, if you put these 63 cities together, the C40 would be the world's 3rd most populous country. That's taking the size of Brazil and the populations of Brazil and the United States and putting them together. The C40 would be the world's 5th largest greenhouse gas emitter, bigger than Japan and growing faster. And the C40 would be the world's 2nd largest economy, tied with China. And our potential to impact climate change is tremendous. The C40 cities collectively have the potential to reduce annual global greenhouse gas emissions by well over 1 billion tons by 2030, compared to business as usual. That would be the same as making Canada and Mexico carbon neutral, or the same as taking all the automobiles in the US off the road entirely. But we all know that potential isn't enough. What's really important, therefore, about the C40 is that mayors and city governments have the power and the willingness to act on climate change. Around the world, our philosophy of change is that urban dwellers are often more likely to endorse action on climate change than rural dwellers. And what this has done is it's pushed mayors out ahead of national leaders on climate issues in country after country. Now, in part, it's because city residents are already more comfortable with the solutions to climate change, including multiple transportation options, public transportation options, denser living, shared spaces, and cutting-edge technology. And in part, it's because cities already face some of the greatest risks from climate change. 90% of the world's cities are in coastal regions, and half of all C40 cities are already dealing with the impacts of climate change. These are mostly from water and energy supply challenges to crumbling infrastructure and flooding. Most of all, though, cities seem to be ready to act because around the world, mayors actually have direct authority over most of the important sources of emissions. So if you look at this chart here, virtually all mayors in large cities control outdoor lighting, city streets, parking, and the emissions associated with those. Most mayors control transit systems, solid waste, and building codes. And about half of all mayors have lead authority over building regulation and city planning decisions. The bottom line is that except for things like agriculture and those emissions, electricity generation, industrial facilities, any national or global climate policy will have to be implemented at the municipal level. And that's true for climate adaptation policies as well. Because in most cases, it is a city government that has to deal with flooding when it happens, that has to deal with limited water supply challenges or extreme weather events. And that is why cities are already leading the way on meeting the challenge of climate change. Despite all of this attention focused on global negotiations and national policies, cities have been racing ahead. According to a report that we did with the consulting group Arup called Climate Action in Megacities, C40 cities have already taken more than 4,700 climate-related actions. Now, I should specify, not all of those are massive actions. Some are pilot projects and pilot programs, but 4,700 different actions. And this was actually determined in 2011. When we release an updated report with Arup next year, we'll see even more. So, with all of this potential and all of this activity, you may be asking, what is C40's role? Well, C40 is a network of the C40 city governments themselves. We don't lobby city governments, provincial governments, state governments, or national governments. We don't advocate, and we don't impose a specific policy or a technical solution. Instead, what we do is we help city officials in these large cities do their jobs better, faster, and more effectively. And we do this using three approaches. The first is by creating networks. Every city official, I'm sure in the region of Peel and all of your municipalities, are bombarded with advice from constituents and advocates, experts and consultants. But that doesn't necessarily help a city official do his or her job. We all know that when we're faced with a challenge, the advice we really need, we can only get from someone who's been in our position. And for a megacity official, implementing a climate change policy or action, what that means is another city official from another megacity who's working on implementing the same or a similar thing. And that's what the C40 networks are all about. We identify specific climate initiatives our cities are working on, and we get the officials directly responsible for their progress together, sometimes in person, but most often by video conference and lots of phone calls. I spend most of my day on the phone. They won't act in unison, these cities. At the end of the day, each city has to implement and has to work for itself, but they will learn from each other, and that helps them get their jobs done faster, better, and smarter. And when they get their jobs done, we think that the planet will benefit. Our second approach is to provide direct support for very specific high-value projects. So as of about 6 months ago, we've based seven regional directors, and regional directors are a senior C40 executive based in each of what we've divided up the 7 regions of the world. And these people are local or regional experts, and they're available to offer advice to city officials, to create some regional sub-networks, and also to provide these cities with the benefit of our research, like the ARIP report and other research that I mentioned before. We also have partnerships with organizations like the World Bank, and that allow us to help our cities, for example, access funding, specific climate finance funding for climate-related projects. We also have a competitive program, this is relatively new as well, that places a full-time staff, fully paid for by C40 and our funders, in a specific city for work on 1 or 2 timely and specific climate initiatives. So the mayor of a city would apply for a fully funded staff person to help for about a year to a year and a half on 1 or 2 specific projects. And our third approach is to develop and share knowledge about what C40 cities are doing. This is not just to get good press, although that's important. It's really because cities need to know what their peers are doing, and we need to know whether C40 cities are making progress towards both their private and publicly stated carbon emission goals. We're working with partners to standardize and institutionalize the annual reporting of city-level carbon emissions. One of our most important partnerships is with the Carbon Disclosure Project. And if you're not familiar with the Carbon Disclosure Project, it's a reporting mechanism for a lot of large corporations around the world. We developed with them a cities program a few years ago to allow for city reporting. And when reporting results are revealed later this year for CDP, over 80% of C40 cities will be shown to have reported their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Now, not only does C40 encourage cities to respond to the Carbon Disclosure Project, but we also work with key allies like ICLEI and other organizations to develop a community-scale GHG emissions reporting protocol. And we are encouraging our cities to use that protocol, and we are working with them to improve the reporting process in each of their cities as well. Now, we also have at the back end of our internal website. Our external website is c40.org, but we have an internal website called the C40 Exchange, and that's a place where we help city officials get in touch with each other and share with each other best practices. We also encourage them to share their war stories and share their mistakes, and some of them are pretty good about doing that. And through our website, our newsletter, social media feeds, we're working not only to tell the world about how much impact cities are having, but we also do give our mayors the credit they deserve when they make progress, because that is an important driver for especially city competitiveness, intra-city competitiveness. And we're already seeing the impact of our work under this model. 2 examples. In Latin America, 7 cities worked through the C40 to test prototypes of hybrid electric buses. As a result, each of those cities was able to make purchasing decisions much faster, and the conversion of up to 30,000 buses is now underway. We also have a network called the Connecting Delta Cities. As I mentioned before, half of C40 cities are located at risk to rising waters. And this is a network that brings together cities physically located in river deltas. And these cities are facing the risk of sea level rise. And this network has helped them develop their climate adaptation plans faster and smarter than they would have done alone. I can tell you that after Hurricane Sandy, New York City became a lot more interested in this network and is now taking a leadership role in this network, and that has all happened in the past 6 months. So C40 has a lot of work to do because our cities have both the desire and the need to make progress. Next February, we'll hold our biannual mayoral summit in Johannesburg, South Africa. Over the next few years, we'll be rolling out new networks on topics ranging from measuring climate risks, a huge and timely topic. We'll also be creating a network on sustainable port cities. And we'll also be creating a network on reducing traffic congestion by information technology, which will really improve quality of life, and I'm sure a few cities in North America could benefit from that. We'll also be adding new cities to our network to go beyond 63. Perhaps we'll be ready for a name change. And these will be especially amongst the growing regions of Asia. What I find one of the most important things we'll be doing is refining our data collection process to ensure that cities are accurately measuring their progress and assessing their risks. But above all, we'll be focused on getting better at helping cities with the organization that they created to get their jobs done. So, what are cities doing in the area of energy use in buildings? Well, a good place to start would be asking why all the focus on buildings. It might be quite clear to some, but to others, you can see in this chart that in C40 cities, building energy use and total energy use accounts for, on average, 45% of total emissions. And this figure goes higher in some regions, as high as 62% here in North America. It's also important to note the variation in city powers over buildings. Whereas mayoral power to drive energy efficiency in public buildings is relatively robust, as you can see in the top half of the chart, the power of cities to control energy use in private buildings, for example, by enacting building regulations or imposing charges, is much less present. So, I think it's time to get to who some of the leaders are for best practices, beginning first with public or municipal building. Well, internationally, London is certainly one. Formally launched in 2010, the Greater London Authority has created something called the REFIT program. This is a standardized program open to all public authorities in the capital, which utilizes a panel of pre-approved energy savings companies, or ESCOs, who install energy efficiency measures with guaranteed energy savings. Since its launch, the REFIT model has been used to retrofit currently only 150 buildings, but that's growing quickly, and each building has achieved at least a 26% energy reduction. What is perhaps most notable for the European market about this program is the recognition that established ESCO players, some of the biggest players in the market, will in fact commit to guaranteed savings contracts under which the ESCOs have to install additional measures or pay the difference in energy costs if what they install does not achieve the results based on the investment grade audit and investment grade proposal. Further, ESCOs have made this commitment pursuant to a specific procurement model open for 3 years, so they're committing for 3 years, which allows public authorities to demand an even greater percentage energy savings. So that's run through a mini competition, and the 12 ESCOs would then decide if they want to bid for the higher than a 26% energy savings. And of course, there are a few aspects of this program that are a little bit less replicable, especially here in North America with a relatively robust ESCO market. For example, to give you an idea, London has received EU funding for a program delivery team. Now, this is essentially funding of up to 90% of the time for consultants to assist the city's delivery team. The idea there is to ensure if a program is going to be funded, it will be high quality. It's also important to note that financing for projects can come from a variety of sources under this program, including a public authority funding from its own budget or borrowing from the capital markets. But to date, almost all public sector bodies that have used this program are utilizing something called prudential borrowing, which is borrowing from the UK's central government. And there's a pot of money available even during the economic downturn that if the borrowing would be prudent, then the central government will provide funding to the public sector authority. This is, I think, probably better than what we have here in North America and in Canada specifically. So overall, with the REFIT program, the pipeline is now full, with approximately 700 additional buildings to be retrofitted this year and the first half of next. And the C40, as I mentioned, is specifically looking to help share this model with our 18 other European cities, because they all face the similar rigid procurement rules and the same opportunities for program support funding. Another European leader is Berlin. They have traditionally set a very high bar when it comes to the refurbishment of public buildings. The Berlin Energy Agency, essentially the city's energy efficiency authority with a public-private ownership model, started not only retrofitting public buildings in the German capital, but they also started consulting internationally with other cities well before the C40 ever existed. They started that as early as 1995. What is unique about their program, which is called the Berlin Energy Savings Partnership, is the pooling of like and similar buildings. To ensure scale that would be of interest to the ESCOs, the program has required that public sector buildings be pooled into categories, and there are 21 categories in total. And these include public schools, public swimming facilities, community centers, and others. You can see on the slide here the results over the past 15 years, and they've been quite successful, including 64,000 tons annually of CO2 saved, and a total net investment, mostly in the late 90s, of over 44 million euros. Through this thoughtful and thorough approach in Berlin, this all means that over the past 15 years, almost all public buildings in Berlin have entered a cycle of retro-commissioning, what we talk about wanting to get to with our public buildings, rather than waiting to be retrofitted in the first instance. So now I will turn to private buildings. I call private buildings the beast because the emissions for them are just so great that we really need to act, all cities need to act in order to meet their climate emission reduction targets. And New York City is a leader here, and it really has to be. 80% of all city emissions come from buildings, and over 80% of those are from private sector buildings. Now, New York elected to employ mostly a regulatory approach in addition to support for the market, and Mayor Bloomberg and his Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability set out to pass a series of 4 local laws known together as the Greener, Greater Buildings Plan. From what I've heard, passing this plan was not easy, so all city officials here should take solace. The first local law, for example, which is already in effect, requires buildings over 50,000 square feet to report their electricity consumption annually. It's a benchmarking and disclosure bylaw. But this required amendments to state legislation, so it required the city to go up to the state capitol and lobby for the power to enact this kind of bylaw, and it was done through a really creative way. And from what I've heard, there was also lots of opposition from building owners maybe that own 1 or 2 buildings that didn't want to go through what they deemed to be an expensive process of benchmarking, and also from large utilities. In the US, there's an issue, large utilities claiming that they would be breaching their customers' privacy if they provided energy data to any third-party partners to this program, whether partners of the building owner or partners of the city. So that took some time to get over. The sustainability team in New York City fought through all of these barriers. It took a long time, over 2 years. And they passed a series of forward-looking, long-term laws that I think set a very good example for other cities in North America to follow. This is my favorite program, actually. It's the world's first local and urban cap-and-trade program. Not enough people know about this one. This is in Tokyo. It was enacted by a local ordinance in 2008, and the program started in earnest in 2010. This program requires Tokyo's 1,300 largest commercial and industrial buildings to meet 2 compliance periods for energy reduction. There's a 6 to 8% energy reduction between 2011 and 2014, and a further 11 to 13% between 2015 and 2019. So what's amazing about this are the results after only 2 years. Tokyo has achieved, and these are not all their buildings, but their 1,300 largest buildings based on energy consumption, a total of a 23% energy reduction across the target buildings. That's over 1.7 million tons per year, and that number is quickly growing. Perhaps more important in terms of best practices and lessons for other cities, is that Tokyo has reported that over 93% of obligated building owners have already achieved, this was reported in January 2012, achieved the target for 2014, and over 50% have already complied with the 2019 target. So to me, that shows the true power of the market when government sets clear long-term targets and allows property owners in their market to decide when and how they will achieve that goal and achieve that obligation. So, where does Toronto and the GTA fit in? As I mentioned at the outset, and this is my disclaimer, I've just recently moved home from London, and so I'm not the expert on energy efficiency here in the region. You all are. I met some of you yesterday. I look forward to meeting more of you later today. And I look forward to learning from you what the region has to share and what the region has to learn from the rest of the world. I can tell you from my experience with C40 that Greater Toronto is getting noticed for a number of initiatives in this space. For example, other C40 cities, through the network that I created, have already interacted with Civic Action on their experiences delivering the Race to Reduce program. Now, you guys may not know this, hopefully you all know of Race to Reduce, but that is the world's second largest voluntary energy efficiency reduction program. It's got over 150 buildings, 30 landlords, 450 tenants, and currently includes about 61 million square feet. For your information, the only program that's larger is the White House's Better Buildings Challenge, and that's got about 1 billion square feet committed, and that's mostly from cities and from large power plants. So we're not quite, Race to Reduce is not quite going to overtake, but is firmly in second place in terms of size. Now, the fact that Race to Reduce has been designed and delivered outside of City Hall in Toronto is really fascinating, and it's an important bellwether for us and for other private sector markets outside of the GTA. C40 cities are also becoming familiar with the work of the Region of Peel and the TRCA, especially with regards to partners in Project Green. We do have a network where we're just deciding exactly how it should work. That would be focused on eco-zones, especially in industrial areas. And there would certainly be the opportunity to speak to and bring in potentially the Region of Peel and the City of Toronto on that one. I know that BOMA Toronto is here, and they continue to help engage their members in and ingrain sustainability by working with utilities. Utilities here are doing great work, people are aware of. BOMA Toronto has developed programs like the Earth Hour Challenge, which I heard this year was a success. All of this is to say that the Toronto region is being noticed on the global stage, but there is obviously still tons to do. So, tying this all together and explaining my role, my job at C40 is to link together sustainability directors and their staff from C40 cities that have prioritized energy efficiency in private sector buildings as a key area of focus. So in this wonderful photo, you can see city officials from 10 C40 cities from places as diverse as Johannesburg and Portland. And this is a meeting that we held in Houston. It was a 2-day workshop focused on this initiative and what each of these cities are doing, what they can share with other cities, and what they can learn from other cities. So, what did we work on? Well, this C40 network has 3 work streams. The first is getting a handle on building energy consumption data. So how can a public official encourage benchmarking by private property owners? There's the question about when data is accumulated, who manages it, cleanses it, and interprets the data. What do building owners really know about energy consumption and the data when tenants are paying? And how can cities drive the tenant interest to access this vital information about their own consumption, that everything that we call the split incentive? The second work stream of the network that a number of cities work on, there's about 15 cities in this network right now. The second work stream recognizes that those cities with power to enact bylaws or mandatory regulation should absolutely do so. So this network helps those cities learn from each other and learn from key global partners who have experience passing such laws about which mandatory measures are likely to be successful in the local market, how you go about engaging the market, and what would be the most effective for the local marketplace. Finally, the third work stream there are incentives, carrots, measures that cities can take to encourage action on the part of private building owners and tenants. How do you create the right mix of financial incentives, recognition programs, technical support, and so on? So, in terms of what we're seeing around the world and some of the emerging trends, I would say in public buildings, it's real-time disclosure of energy use. I recognize that's quite small. Apologies for that. I should have made it its own slide. But the photo in this slide is taken from the website of an organization called Carbon Culture. It's a nonprofit based in London and run by just a really quirky and funny computer programmer turned sustainability activist who's based in London. So this is a web page on carbonculture.net, and it shows the real-time energy performance of government office buildings of the UK's Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, called DEFRA. So displayed at the building level, automated readings from the buildings are fed directly to the organization's servers and show updated data revised every 5 seconds. So the box on the bottom right there is actually updated every 5 seconds. And the metrics that it shows include kilowatt hours per hour being consumed in specific buildings and across the department, kilograms of CO2 per hour, and the energy spend on individual buildings and the aggregate of buildings per hour. And at the top right, again, apologies it's so small, is a display energy rating for each office building within the department. So display energy ratings are actually required under EU law. Every member state in the EU is required to pass a scale from A to G, and public buildings over 1,000 square meters are obligated to benchmark and make that publicly available. So that's what the figures there show for the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. If you click on one of the buildings themselves, it will take you to a separate page showing the daily, weekly, and monthly electricity and gas consumption for that specific building. The building specifications will be on there, including the build year, total usable floor area, heating type, and number of occupants. And what I think is most important as a trend is that all the data is made available for public consumption. Anyone can go and download it and study it. And there's an emerging trend of, tell me if you've heard about this, hackathons, where data is made available and then mobile app developers and others get together generally over a weekend with lots of pizza and some beer and develop apps that are using this data for a public benefit. So to date, Carbon Culture has been better received by the UK's national government rather than the Greater London Authority, but they and we are hoping that that changes. And the reason why I bring up this example is because in the past month or 6 weeks, I have heard from at least 4 or 5 other cities that they are working on variations of the exact same thing. And I know that some municipalities here in Ontario are looking at that as well. How do you get the data? How do you make it look interesting to read? And how do you get it up there? And what are the issues and challenges surrounding that? In private sector buildings, the emerging trend is for cities to set the parameters of action to get to their own targets, what they need from the private sector to get to their target, and then to design actual incentives and programs with the private sector. So basically, unless a city is willing to regulate against the will of the private sector, a city government would be much better served, we think, to utilize the profile of the mayor or a sustainability director and bring key market players into City Hall, into Town Hall, to design the actions that they, the market, will subsequently take. Most importantly, for C40, we're seeing that cities are willing to act and that cities are showing a desire to learn from each other and take the best parts of each other's programs and policies. So, what are the lessons learned? Well, first, it's about policies, but also programs. Cities should absolutely use all the regulatory powers that they have to enact mandatory policies where possible. For those cities that don't have such power, and as I said, it's about 50-50 for C40 megacities, incentive programs are really key. This photo on the right, if you can't read it, it says, "There are many tall buildings in Chicago. Here are a few we really look up to." So this photo is actually a full-page ad donated by the Chicago Tribune in June 2012 to promote the first 14 buildings that committed to that city's version of the race to reduce, called the Commercial Buildings Initiative, part of Retrofit Chicago. So this type of publicity, this ad here, was matched by an announcement with the property owners by Mayor Rahm Emanuel, and there was also a press release from the Office of the Mayor. And quite frankly, that seems to be providing the incentive that these property owners, the extra incentive, that these property owners needed to commit to a fairly difficult target. It's 20% over 5 years. And some of these buildings are quite new. There's a building that's 107 years old and a building that's only 7 years old. So we think that, of course, the obvious benefits of retrofitting and being energy efficient, plus that added publicity from the mayor's office, helped encourage. And this program is now growing, soon to be the size of Race to Reduce, though with fewer property owners and with fewer tenants. Lesson number 2 is that we're seeing governments leading by example, and we think this is fantastic. There are obviously good reasons for cities to lead by example. First and foremost, of course, wasted energy in government buildings is taxpayer money. But perhaps more importantly than that for long-term energy efficiency in a city is that city governments realize that the private sector may just follow their lead. So public sector building retrofitting helps prove the business case. It helps build the local ESCO market, which is definitely necessary in most parts of the world. And it helps develop the service market, consulting market, all of which are key parts to really pushing that decision for private sector buildings, owners and tenants to retrofit. Finally, lesson number 3 is it's all about relationships and it's all about people. In public buildings, this means building the political case and the technical expertise slowly but surely. Ensuring that facility managers are on board is key. I have heard from a number of city officials that facility managers fear that they will be made to look bad if an ESCO gets brought in and saves 25% on energy costs. So communicating that this won't be the case, assuming that it won't be the case, is vital. In private buildings, it appears from our experience that the most successful cities are the ones that are closest to their local stakeholders. So success for programs that are 2 years away from launch today are sowed in the roundtables, networking events, and municipal-led summits held today. Again, the relative success and the great success so far of Toronto's Race to Reduce program and the region's Race to Reduce program, for example, that can be tied to how program managers work closely with the intended participants to design a program that appeals to the local market. As I am told, and as the interactions that I've had, that started with a summit that was attended by mostly property owners and large tenants, and they decided what they would commit to, not the other way around. So hopefully this virtual around the world tour has been valuable to you. The Greater Toronto region is near the top of global regions in terms of working with stakeholders to curb energy demands in buildings. Hopefully the examples that I shared this morning with you give you all a few ideas to take away, whether you are a public official yourself, a property owner, an industrial facility owner, a tenant, or a consultant. This slide seemed, I thought it was appropriate because emissions from buildings, and especially from private buildings, are just too big, and they're too big for us to fail if municipalities and cities are to meet their climate change reduction targets. So that's how you connect with us. That's our contact information. If you'd like to reach out to C40, my email is on the slide. Thanks for listening, and I think we do have some time for questions, really more than questions. I'm quite happy if people want to use the microphones to comment on what they're working on, and I guess we'll have Steve moderate. So thanks for your time.
We do have time for a couple of questions. If anyone would please like to approach either the two mics that we have. Okay, mic number 2 over here, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for an excellent presentation. I'm David Katz, and I'm involved with the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel, and my responsibility is building to grid, including recognition of the environmental impacts of the energy in buildings. So I look forward to showing how we could connect with our network of control companies, of utilities that are working on the standards. My question has to go to the C40 and the carbon trading. The cities that do this, do they contribute those credits to the Clinton Climate Initiative? Do they retire them? Is there going to be a trading market? So if California, now with cap and trade, do they get to put money on the value of those emissions to make it economic? Can you comment on that?
No, they're within the C40 and the Clinton Climate Initiative. The idea is that we're helping each city achieve the targets that they've set. So if a city chooses to be part of a regional carbon trading scheme, then that's up to them. So we don't have any. We have one program called the Climate Positive Program, and that's a program that we design and we take to cities. Otherwise, it's for each city to determine their priority initiatives, and we just help them with that. So there's no new carbon scheme.
Okay, I look forward to touching base with you. Thanks.
Sure. Please go ahead. Mic number 2.
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation. I know a lot of folks here, I guess, are from, what I'd say, smaller cities. We're not mega cities. In my case, I'm from the other London, the small one just down the road. And I guess so I have two questions kind of related. One is with the C40 initiative, because I know a lot of our local citizens will say, London and Ontario should join the C40 initiatives. And my question is, the first one is the focus of C40 truly to focus on the mega cities and not sort of those medium sort of mid-sized regional cities, whether that's a yes or no. And the second one is, in terms of the resources available, is there a role? Is C40 interested in providing sort of some resources that even a lot of the smaller municipalities in Ontario can just tap into?
So the likely unsatisfying answer, if you like the presentation, is that we don't invite into the network smaller cities just because there really would be thousands of them. So we make some strategic decisions about how fast we grow. I should say that there are other great organizations working on these topics, specifically with other municipalities that aren't quite as large. Our theory of change is that mega cities have some really, I spoke about some European examples, but there are cities in the developing parts of Asia and Africa that are, their issues would just be so much different from a Toronto or a New York or a London, Ontario. So we don't go below the kind of 1 million mark for sure. But there's the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. So it's called USDN, and that's specifically for North American sustainability directors. ICLEI does great work. In Europe, there's the Covenant of Mayors, which is 400 or 500 mayors all within Europe, and those cities range in size. So the unsatisfying answer is we grow very slowly, but as I mentioned in the presentation, we're likely to grow in Asia, where there are cities that are 5 million people, with no public transportation. So we think they can learn a lot from, a Bogota, which has a bus rapid transit that was really the first great one around the world.
Right. Thank you.
No problem.
Can we go over to mic number 1, please?
Good morning. Just like to invite you to investigate SWR, Sustainable Waterloo Region. It's a not-for-profit organization very similar to Partners in Project Green. Activities are similar, and there's a lot of community outreach and engagement. It's very interesting to look at.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'm happy to follow up. I should mention as well, because we know that regions are so important. So there is something called the and we're not really affiliated with them. We certainly know what they're doing, and they know what we're doing. The R20, so 20 regions around the world. I mean, the Greater Toronto and Hamilton region. I'm not sure where the border for that ends, and if there's a better term to include kind of the golden horseshoe. But we know that stuff happens in regions. Public transportation needs to be planned regionally, and obviously some of that is happening here in Toronto now. So there are some great organizations. I would encourage you to check out the R20 as well.
Okay, over mic number 2.
Jonathan, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm just wondering, though, amongst the various instruments that C40 cities are looking at, are any looking at carbon charges or preferred variation on that, revenue neutral carbon charges, whereby a price would be put on carbon and largely, if not totally, refunded through property tax rebates? Are any of your cities looking at that mechanism?
Sure. So C40 has 7 initiatives. One of them is called Finance and Economic Development. And that's something that we, so within each of the initiatives, we have a few networks. There's about 12 networks, and I was speaking this morning about the private sector buildings energy efficiency network. So currently that does not exist. We know that certainly there are a few cities that are looking at, a city level carbon tax or implementing a carbon tax that's state, provincial, or federal. But we don't yet have a network on that. So I don't have too much information on that. I'd like to hear more, though.
Let's start one.
Sure.
Thank you.
The difficult thing is that networks get started by 5 or 6 cities all kind of saying to us, again, we don't push anything on cities because if we're going to be global, that doesn't work very well. So we really wait for a few cities to come and say, we're working on this. And then someone in my position would say, City A, you should talk to City B, and we would facilitate the interactions in person and over the phone. So once that happens, that's the impetus for us to start a network on a carbon tax within a city and any others.
Great. Oh, sorry. Sure, we've got time for.
I was going to ask a quick question. Could you explain? I'm familiar with ICLEI to some degree, and I've not run into the Carbon Disclosure Project. And I noticed you selected Carbon Disclosure Project. Is that over ICLEI or in addition to ICLEI, or could you expand on that a little?
Sure. They're quite different. So ICLEI, as I understand it, I'm not an expert on ICLEI, they're quite similar to C40, where it's the local governments for sustainability. So they work, I'm not sure if there is someone here from ICLEI, but they work with hundreds of local governments around North America and perhaps around the world to support them in the same way that C40 supports cities and municipalities. The Carbon Disclosure Project is a separate organization based in, I believe, New York and London. They started first as a movement to get really Fortune 500 and Fortune 1000 companies to report their emissions. So at first there was a few hundred corporations reporting, and then a few years ago we worked with them to say, why don't we get cities, which are mostly corporations as well, different kind of corporation, but corporations as well, to report their emissions. And then so now there's probably 2,000 or so companies that report through Carbon Disclosure Project, which is really just they put out a report of emissions, where emissions are at based on who's reported. And as I said, about 80% of our cities, so 45 cities or so, will be reporting this year.
Okay, sorry, let's go to mic number 2, I guess, please.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. My name is Adam Vai. I work with Partners in Project Green. And I'm really curious as to what kind of staff you guys have on the C40 team, as well as your strategic partnerships that really meet the needs of the city officials and their goals that they need to accomplish.
Well, I would say not enough. We are growing. Again, because our model is to facilitate city-to-city interactions, it allows us to be relatively lean. Our whole staff is only about 40 people. So we have, obviously some executives. We have a regional director. So there's a regional director for North America who's based in San Francisco. She has experience working with the city of San Francisco and with the city of Portland, I believe. And so her job is to, kind of be our boots on the ground, so to speak, in North America, find out what each city is doing. But again, except for a few specific staff, which I mentioned, which are city directors, and currently there's about 15 of them out of the 63 cities, we don't really have any staff on the ground. The City of Toronto used to have a city director up until a few years ago. So again, the idea is that I'm working mostly remotely with the cities most interested in private sector building, energy efficiency, and just putting them in touch with each other. We recognize that it's smart to develop some key partnerships so that I can rely on that expertise. There's an organization based in the US called the Institute for Market Transformation, and they do really good work. And so they're going to soon be a partner of this network because they've actually helped a number of those cities. There's about 8 US cities with a mandatory benchmarking and disclosure bylaw, and they've helped most of them with the language of the law, with the engagement. So I'm not going to be the expert on how to write a bylaw for that. I'll get IMT to help out.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Devin Cosley from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Just to speak to the earlier question on the ICLEI process versus the Carbon Disclosure Project. In Canada, FCM and ICLEI are partnered on the Partners for Climate Protection program, which is similar, a network currently of 240 Canadian cities working on emissions reductions and energy management. We also do help with performance measurement, quantification, and produce a national report on what municipalities are implementing. So be interested to connect more with C40 and how we can learn from the work you're doing internationally.
Yeah, absolutely. The work of FCM I've heard is great. I'd love to know more about it. And for everyone's information, currently the C40 cities in Canada are Toronto and Vancouver. That could change in the future, but all of this is to say that there is existing support for some of the smaller municipalities through ICLEI, FCM, and others.
Great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I really enjoyed your presentation and absolutely covering off all kinds of great things, especially you mentioned how cities are unique, but yet they share a lot in common. And I love the parts of the program, especially the peer-to-peer exchange that you talked about, the measurement for management aspects, all of which I think will be great. And certainly by recognizing those immense opportunities that cities and regions have, if they can fully utilize both the incentives and the policies together, that can really work towards lowering energy consumption and the associated emissions to go with them. So thank you very much, Jonathan. Please, a round of applause for Jonathan.